research. Caroline's research focuses on the relationships between language and other cognitive factors in children with language disorders, including developmental language disorder and autism spectrum disorder, with the long-term goal of improving differential diagnosis and treatment. So with that, go ahead, Caroline.
Hi, thanks so much, Anna Marie, or Anne Marie, I'm sorry. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Get everything sorted. Okay. Everyone can hear me okay? Okay. So yeah, I'm excited to talk with you all today about this project. I will point out that it's a bit of an in-progress project. So if you have comments or feedback, we absolutely welcome it. And I will give a little preview. We're still working with our brain data, so that will be a discussion of hypotheses. So that might be a great place for open discussion as well. So yeah, these are my project collaborators. This project is a part of the Altos larger project that Anne-Marie Eichstein and Deb Fine are the principal investigators of. And I will jump right in. Okay. There we go. So these are the populations I'll discuss today: autism spectrum disorder and loss of autism diagnosis. You can see a couple of very coarse bullet points about key criteria for ASD versus LAD status. And I'm going to talk about the ASD group first, and then I'll discuss LAD in a little bit more detail. So autism spectrum disorder has a relatively high prevalence, and based on the current edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5, ASD involves deficits in social communication and social interaction that lead to functional difficulty, such as in developing and maintaining relationships. ASD is characterized by restricted and repetitive interests and behaviors as well that result in functional impairment, such as in effectively participating in the classroom. These restrictive, repetitive interests and behaviors may involve insistence on sameness, like wanting to reduce the amount of sensory information or sensory changes in their environment. Individuals with ASD have also been shown to have attentional difficulties, such as elevated rates of ADHD symptomology. One common presentation of underlying difficulties related to ASD that may affect social skills is diminished eye contact. And one common presentation of restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests is fixated interest on lining up cars, for example. Now, loss of autism diagnosis is one possible outcome or one trajectory of autism spectrum disorder. In order to be classified as LAD, individuals must very clearly meet criteria for ASD in childhood and very clearly not meet criteria for ASD later in development. There are really similar proportions across prospective and retrospective studies from different research groups. About 9% of participants with ASD may go on to have LAD status. So this consistency across multiple research groups suggests that individuals with LAD represent an important trajectory from childhood to later development in ASD, and that LAD is not likely related to measurement error or misclassification issues. Furthermore, examining this LAD trajectory might reveal mechanisms of change in autism spectrum disorder. In prior work from our lab, we applied a rigorous set of eligibility criteria. First, diagnostic status was determined using gold standard assessments paired with expert clinical judgment, both at early ASD diagnosis and later LAD status determination. Beyond the early ASD diagnosis, early language delay, such as late onset of first words or phrases, was also required. Standard scores like in IQ, nonverbal or verbal IQ, socialization, and communication were required to be within the average range of neurotypical peers. And LAD participants were fully included in the general education classroom and were not receiving autism-related specialty services. A child who goes on to be in the LAD group might present with behaviors much like a child who continues to meet ASD criteria throughout their lives. An example of this behavior might be lining up cars. Alternatively, The behavior of an adolescent or young adult who meets criteria for LAD group membership might be relatively indistinguishable from neurotypical peers in adolescence or adulthood, which could be in contrast to the behavior of an adolescent or adult who continues to meet ASD criteria, where they likely present or experience difficulty with social skills and present with patterns of restricted and repetitive interests and behaviors. Importantly, eligibility criteria for LAD group membership does not require intact structural language skills in many prior studies. And we know that there is a subgroup of individuals with ASD who have co-occurring structural language impairment that resembles structural language difficulties observed in a disorder defined by structural language impairment, developmental language disorder. Some work that has examined structural language in LAD suggests the presence of subtle differences relative to neurotypical comparison groups. Although these patterns occur in the context of normal range performance on average in the LAD group, the ranges of performance suggest that at least some individuals with LAD might fall below the clinical cutoff for a language impairment. We don't know to what degree structural language impairment occurs in LAD, or whether structural language impairment in some individuals with LAD resembles that observed in individuals with ASD. Furthermore, is potential structural language impairment distinct from other features of ASD and residual difficulties observed in LAD, such as in social communication and attention? Well, first, what might structural language impairment actually look like? So it may present in language expression, such as omitting tense markers in obligatory context. It may also present in language comprehension or receptive language, such as a semantic rather than syntactic interpretation of passive sentences. So this sentence might be interpreted as who chased the dog rather than who did the dog chase. Social communication and attention are also related to structural language skills. We know that social communication and attention difficulties are observed in ASD, and residual difficulties in these areas have been noted in LAD. Structural language impairment is present in ASD, distinct from their social communication and attention difficulties. So it's possible that structural language impairment that might be present in LAD would be distinct from social communication and attention as well. Or it's possible that social communication and attention explain structural language deficits in LAD. And this issue represents our first research question. So to what degree does distinct structural language impairment occur in LAD versus ASD? We also wanted to know what brain function might tell us about mechanisms of change underlying behavioral profiles in ASD versus LAD that might reflect differences in developmental trajectories between individuals with a current diagnosis of ASD versus individuals with LAD status. We might expect brain function to reveal something about developmental mechanisms underlying overlap and distinction in behavioral language profiles in these groups relative to neurotypical peers. So for instance, we know that childhood is characterized, or early childhood, I should say, is characterized by significant language-related activation in both the left and right hemisphere, which becomes increasingly lateralized to the left hemisphere across development, in the absence of lesions or other brain atypicalities. So in other words, we see the left hemisphere become dominant or specialized for language across development. But if this process or mechanism of increasing left hemisphere lateralization does not occur as expected, it suggests atypicality in language development and perhaps compensatory neural activation in the right hemisphere. And I'll use the relative shading of these little brain images to reflect degree of activation in this talk, but bear in mind this is a very coarse manner of depicting degree of activation. So in two studies on lateralization in ASD, findings indicated more similar patterns of lateralization, meaning left versus right hemisphere activation, between ASD groups and comparison groups with language impairment than between either clinical group and neurotypical peers. So atypical lateralization relative to neurotypical peers in language regions in the left hemisphere and language homologue regions in the right hemisphere suggests atypical hemispheric specialization for language in ASD and the language impairment group. So diminished left hemisphere lateralization may signify an atypical trajectory of language development in the brain, as well as potentially less efficient neural processing of language or difficulties with language expression or comprehension. Importantly, individuals in our LAD group presented with language delay early in development as part of their early childhood presentation of ASD, such as later onset of first words relative to neurotypical peers. We've also observed subtle differences in behavioral language performance in adolescents and young adults with LAD relative to their neurotypical peers. So examining language-related lateralization in LAD may further clarify the degree to which structural language difficulty in LAD is similar to that seen in ASD. And also, how might behavioral profiles in LAD that are much more similar to neurotypical peers reflect their LAD status versus their history of an ASD diagnosis. So examining language-related activation in the left versus right hemisphere during a language task might shed more light on this question. So our first research question related to behavioral performance was, to what extent does structural language impairment exist in individuals with LAD relative to peers with a current ASD diagnosis? And we wanted to know, does that potential structural language impairment occur distinct from residual difficulties in social communication and attention? We also wanted to know, to what degree is behaviorally manifested structural language difficulty reflected in functional lateralization in language and language homologue brain regions? What might this reveal about language development trajectories in these groups? Okay, so let's start with information about the participants in the current study. So we had a neurotypical group, an LAD group, and an ASD group. And you can see that we didn't have significant differences on sex assigned at birth or age. And we did have limitations in racial and ethnic makeup that are important to consider, specifically for generalizability. Here we can see the criteria related to ASD status. So the ASD group had significantly more ASD symptoms than the neurotypical and LAD groups, who did not differ on any ASD symptom scale. For our language, social communication, and attention measures, we first used the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals, the recalling sentences subscale, as our clinical marker of possible structural language impairment. So recalling sentences is more specific to grammatical weakness, like we'd see in this structural language impairment subgroup, than a composite measure, which also includes vocabulary. Our measure of social communication was the social communication questionnaire, which measures communication within social interactions, such as conversational turn-taking and recognition of common ground. As our measure of attention, we used the Schedule for Affective Disorders and Schizophrenia for School-Age Children ADHD index. So this is a categorical variable indicating whether a participant met criteria for ADHD or did not. So here you can see first that while all participants had a relatively high nonverbal IQ and relatively high language scores, meaning that their scores are broadly within the average range of neurotypical peers. Second, all groups differ on core language, and both the ASD and LAD groups differed from neurotypical peers on recalling sentences, but the ASD and LAD groups did not differ significantly from each other on that measure. And here we see a similar pattern for social communication as core language. So all groups differed significantly. But for the ADHD index, we find that, we also find that all groups differed significantly. Got ahead of myself. But what stands out to me here is that the LAD group sort of represents an intermediary position between the neurotypical and ASD groups on these measures. So briefly, I'll describe our statistical approach. We imputed missing data using predictive mean matching and analyzed the language impairment subgroup descriptive statistics using non-parametric analyses, due in part to the sample size. And our comparisons between language and social communication and attention, we analyzed using the Bayesian framework. So briefly, under this framework, the 95% posterior probability interval is reported rather than frequentist-based p-values. So this PPI interval is interpreted as the 95% probability that the true value lies in that range. So we interpreted an effect to be important if 0 was not contained within that interval. And here's the methodological information for our task-based fMRI, which was conducted through the Brain Imaging Research Center here at UConn. And our ROIs our regions of interest were based on Baker and Collings 2018, the Connectomic Atlas of the Human Cortex. And this accounts for anatomy, connectivity, and function related to language. And you can see the list of those ROIs here. I'm happy to describe further at the end if people are interested. And our task in the fMRI, for the fMRI portion of this project, was a sentence comprehension task where participants responded using a simple truth value judgment. So a yes or no, true or untrue. And then the lateralization was analyzed using a laterality index, really similar to Carla, if you know Carla, her laterality index for her master's thesis. And we computed this laterality index for language function for each cluster. So specifically, this laterality index involves subtracting the average activation within each parcel in the left from right hemisphere and dividing this value by the summed absolute value of average activation in the left plus right hemispheres. So basically what that means is a value of 1 means complete left lateralization and a value of -1 means complete right lateralization. And of course, this is what we plan to use. So I welcome any feedback or discussion related to this portion. Okay, so let's discuss the descriptive behavioral characteristics of the language impairment subgroup. So we have the LAD-LI group in the left and the ASD-LI group on the right. And what we can see here is neither the LAD-LI group or ASD-LI group differed from each other on any of our language measures, but they both differed significantly from neurotypical peers. So it's somewhat of a validation that we perhaps found subgroups with language weakness. We can also see that both LAD-LI and ASD-LI groups differed significantly from neurotypical peers on social communication, but not from each other on social communication. And both groups differed from the neurotypical group on ADHD status, but they also differed from each other on ADHD status. So the ASD-LI group, every participant who met ASD-LI criteria also met criteria for ADHD. So the ASD-LI and LAD-LI groups appear to be rather similar across these measures, except with regard to ADHD status. Okay, so let's talk about proportions of individuals who met criteria for language impairment within the ASD and LAD groups. So here we have language status on the x-axis and count on the y-axis, panels for the ASD group and the LAD group. And this graph is showing us that we have relatively similar proportions of individuals meeting criteria for language impairment within the LAD and ASD groups. And the small, tiny, less of a percent of difference was not significant, probably no surprise. Okay, so at this stage, our results suggest overlapping structural language impairment groups and profiles. But what about the relationship between language and social communication? So let me orient you to this graph first. We have social communication on the x-axis, recalling sentences, scaled scores on the y-axis, and we have a panel for ASDLI, ASDLN, LADLI, and LADLN groups. So when examining the relationship between language and social communication, we did not see an important effect of social communication at the full ASD or LAD group level, nor a group difference in the relationship between language and social communication. We also did not see an important effect of social communication within the language impairment subgroups. And perhaps this relationship is slightly more evident in the LADLI group in the lower left, but 0 was contained in the posterior probability interval, suggesting that this was not a meaningful relationship. Okay, so what about language and attention, or ADHD status? We saw previously, there is a group difference in the number of participants meeting criteria for ADHD in the ASD versus LAD full groups, as well as within the language impairment subgroups. And we see that here. So again, we have panels for ASDLI, ASDLN, LADLI, LADLN. And we have ADHD status in the x-axis and count in the y-axis. So you can see, I think, perhaps the most notable finding here is that every participant in the ASDLI group did meet criteria for ADHD. However, when examining the relationship between language and ADHD status, we did not see an important effect of ADHD status in the ASD or LAD group, or a group difference in this effect. We also did not see an important effect of ADHD status within the language impairment subgroup. So to summarize, we didn't find a significant difference in the proportion of ASDLI and LADLI participants within our higher order groups. And there's little evidence of ASDLI versus LADLI differences in language or social communication, but both of these subgroups differed from neurotypical peers. So these patterns may suggest that ASDLI and LADLI involve quite similar profiles, even in these areas of social communication and attention, where we'd expect the full ASD group to have poorer performance than the full LAD group. There may be an important difference between the ASDLI and LADLI groups in ADHD status, because every participant in the ASDLI group met criteria for ADHD, whereas only about half met criteria for ADHD in the LADLI subgroup. However, there was little evidence of an important relationship between ADHD status and language, and there's no ASDLI versus LADLI group difference in the relationship between ADHD status and language. So together, these findings suggest that neither ADHD status or social communication accounted for structural language skills in these subgroups. And although this evidence points to similar profiles in ASDLI and LADLI, further work detailing patterns of language production and comprehension strengths and weaknesses is absolutely necessary to look at on a more detailed scale their language abilities. So with regard to our second research question on functional lateralization, we hypothesized that brain function would reflect language impairment based on diminished language-related left hemisphere lateralization as compared to neurotypical peers. And because we're still analyzing these data, I will further specify our hypotheses and what prior work led to these hypotheses. So with the same participants that we're using in the current study, IC and colleagues 2016 demonstrate evidence of residual ASD-like activation patterns in their LAD group during a language task. So both the LAD and ASD groups had activation that significantly differed from the neurotypical group, but did not differ from each other. And an example of this pattern is depicted in the bar graph. The study found no evidence of normalized neural pathways, meaning there's no evidence of neural pathways in LAD that were similar to neurotypical peers. And a majority of the group differences followed a neural compensation pattern in which the LAD group showed heightened activation relative to both the ASD and neurotypical groups. And this finding is depicted in the brain figures. And they show heightened LAD activation in language and language homolog regions, such as the precentral temporal gyrus and the right supramarginal gyrus. So given these interesting patterns of left and right hemisphere activation during a language task, it may be particularly important to consider lateralization of language function LAD, and I'm going to explain just a touch further. So based on Oluvade et al. 2020, we know that the left hemisphere lateralization increases over the course of development. And using the same ROIs that we're using in the current study, Carla's master's thesis showed that language-related areas predominantly had a pattern of left hemisphere lateralization in a sample of neurotypical college-age students, and that's the lower figure that you see here. So we expect to see similar patterns in neurotypical individuals and in neurotypical neural networks, but perhaps diminished lateralization in neural networks that reflect ASD or LAD. We know that all individuals with LAD and ASD had early language delay, so we may see an enhanced activation in the right hemisphere in LAD and in ASD, whereas left and right hemisphere activation might reflect compensation in LAD. Right hemisphere activation, we think, reflects disruption in language development. So we may see a similar absolute value for the laterality index in LADLI and ASDLI that's less than their peers, LAD and ASD peers, who don't have structural language impairment. We also might expect to see additional compensatory activation in the LADLI group in regions not activated in the ASDLI group. So, other than the greater proportion of individuals meeting ADHD criteria in the ASD than LAD group, we found something like this in our behavioral data. We might hypothesize that the neural data will reveal something like this, given that both groups experience early disruption to language development and features of ASD early in development. And the language impairment subgroups appear to have similar behavioral profiles thus far. However, because we also know that these groups experience divergent trajectories, it's possible that there are group differences in brain function and lateralization, such as the compensation previously observed in LAD, in addition to brain function reflecting prior ASD symptomology. So it's possible that the neural data could look more like this. Where there's activation in additional networks in LADLI, not observed in ASDLI, even though the absolute value of lateralization is similar. So this difference in neural activation may reveal something about the role of attention that we weren't able to detect in our behavioral analyses as well. Of course, that's a large hypothesis. So in conclusion, we are seeing similarities in behavioral patterns, including the relationship between language and social communication and language and attention in ASDLI and LADLI. And this similarity may reflect ASD history and may suggest that intact structural language abilities are not a prerequisite for at least some individuals to follow the LAD developmental trajectory. However, we've not completely ruled out this scenario where there is overlap and distinction in ASDLI and LADLI profiles, due in large part to differences between these subgroups in attention, and of course in our small sample sizes and limited generalizability. I would argue that our data do not support this hypothesis, given the similarities in behavioral profiles, separate from the heightened presence of ADHD and ASD. And there appears to be some evidence of prior ASD history in the LAD group, suggesting at least a partially overlapping structural language impairment profile. If you look at potential neural findings, they may provide support for this scenario, suggesting overlap related to a history of ASD and early language delay. But due to divergent current profiles of behavioral and neural functioning related to attention and ASD symptomology, we might find both ASD-like activation and additional networks not drawn upon by the ASD group in the LAD group, as well as similar absolute values of lateralization. And this latter finding would suggest compensation similar to that observed in Ikesby and colleagues 2016. This finding would also align with a growing body of evidence suggesting that individuals with LAD are relatively indistinguishable from neurotypical peers, suggesting fewer functional barriers in LAD relative to ASD peers, even when structural language impairment might be present. So of course, we are really excited to analyze our fMRI data, if you can't tell. Thought a lot about it. And of course, we have important limitations in our language impairment subgroups. They become quite tiny, and the makeup of our participants is limited. And while we can comment on group and subgroup patterns, we have more work to do before we can generalize to a broader, more representative population. We'd also like to take a deeper dive into characterizing language profiles in the language impairment subgroups, given what we know about functional barriers in LAD versus ASD. And we might see something like the linguistic errors present in LAD-LI present less of a functional barrier to social interaction potentially than in their ASD-LI peers. We also have some non-overlapping participants in our behavioral and brain data. So some participants only contributed behavioral data and some only fMRI data. So we hope to have a more complete overlap for perhaps more direct comparisons between behavioral and neural findings in future work. And then, yes, big thank yous. So much of this was done long before I was ever in the picture. So, and this is a picture of some of the Altos group here. Thank you to our collaborators and the families and personnel and students who are very involved in this work, and of course, our funding agencies. And I will stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody unless we need to look at something.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we can go ahead and open the floor up to graduate students. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and or put your question in the chat, and I'll be happy to take it. Kayla, or Kaya, sorry.
That's okay, no problem. Thanks for a great talk, very interesting. So you kind of alluded to this in your limitations just now, or your future directions, I guess. But I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about your thoughts on how these results might change or not when you're sort of including a more holistic view of language skills, especially given the different social and attentional demands of conversation versus something like the self subtest you looked at.
Yeah, Kaya, that's a great question. So I think what I'm catching is you're pointing out that we looked at sort of a very limited understanding of language in these groups, specifically focusing on recalling sentences. And that's motivated by our focus on sort of this grammatical impairment subgroup rather than a larger group with more with lower language skills sort of across these different constructs of language that we think about. And I think that's one, if we look at broader language skills, we will see more connections between attention and social communication and language. We did some of these analyses using the core language composite from the self, which includes vocabulary and concepts and following directions. And we did see, potentially driven by the participants with language skills within the normal range across the board, relationships between ADHD status and social communication and that core language measure. But I think that's also interesting because it sort of points to and aligns with other work showing that this grammatical impairment maybe is a little bit more distinct or maybe follows its own trajectory more so than this other set of skills. which I think would also make sense with our finding that this LAD group, the Loss of Autism Diagnosis group, who perform really well on most of our measures, and you can see that from the standard scores on nonverbal IQ and others, it might explain why we can even still observe any kind of language impairment in that group, because it's this sort of more divergent grammatical weakness. Yeah, but I, of course, yeah, would love to just dig in and profile every component.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we can open up the floor to questions from anyone. So if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat.
If I can add a thought to the really thoughtful question from Kaya there and amplify a little bit to Carrie's response. I think I would make the prediction that we would see the group differences get much larger when we, between the differences between the LAD and the ASD groups. I think they'll be really magnified when we take a more holistic look at abilities there, because while the LAD group did sort of struggle with some of these structural language markers in testing with the self, I think the data that we have so far suggests that they have developed a lot of, I mean, they've developed compensatory neural structures, but also a lot of other kinds of compensatory skills that allow them to, I think, stay on track in a conversation and make use of other cues during discourse and so on. So I suspect that they'll look sort of better and more intact when we include a sort of a richer amount of data for them. But good, a fantastic question.
Thanks, Ingeborg. Yeah, and I will say that there are some really great papers out there that look at some of these sort of constructs that Ingeborg is speaking to, like there's a Fillers paper, use of like and in conversation, I think, maybe in narrative. And then, oh, what's the other one? The story goodness ratings by naive listeners suggest exactly what Ingeborg is speaking to.
I have a question kind of related to what Ingeborg was mentioning. So I know that you talked about one thing that might be happening is some of these kinds of compensatory mechanisms. I'm wondering if you expect the majority of these to be functional, structural, or kind of split between the two. Like where do you expect to see the most evidence of these kinds of compensatory mechanisms?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm thinking you're talking about brain, not including behavior as much, right? Structural, functional.
And perhaps behavior as well. Do you expect this to be like really a kind of learned behavioral skill, or do you expect it in brain? And if in brain, where?
Yeah, I think what some of the prior work has shown that, and I'm not as familiar with the structural work on this group or in ASD as much in general, I'll admit, but my understanding is that when we do see these functional differences, there are often related or parallel structural differences just in how the brain develops and wires itself. But I think, you know, I sort of view the functional measures as an in the moment, what's happening, what processes are taking place to achieve this behavior that's relatively strong if you compare it to, and if you think about what these behaviors these kids were presenting in childhood. So yeah, I do think that behaviorally that you see some of these compensatory strategies too, but yeah, I'm not quite sure what they would look like. I need to think about that a little more, and maybe I can punt that to Ingeborg as well.
I mean, I think it's a really interesting open question. Maybe a useful analog might be to look at some of the work that they're doing at Georgetown, looking at infants who have perinatal hemiplegia and who are missing oftentimes pretty important parts of left hemisphere. And those kids end up developing and having sort of language, behavioral language scores and abilities in the average range. And I think the functional MRI data from that group are hard to compare here, but it's not the case that they totally rebuild, right? I mean, the brain building is sort of done early, and it's not like they fill in those holes in missing cortical space. Even though they have all this kind of compensatory behavioral stuff that's happened. So I would suspect that structurally the LAD brains are going to look more similar to their peers who still have autism, despite the functional differences.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk, and I am not a language expert. I just have a very general question. I really appreciate you pointing out that Alulad paper. I just pulled it up after you cite it. And so I just have a very broad question of like, what are your opinions or thoughts about this idea of these developmental changes in lateralization of the brain, and how we might be missing out on something by not kind of considering that, or how do you think the field is approaching that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, really neat too. I really just started to take a dive into it, and I'm fascinated, especially as I think, my doctoral work was focused on developmental language disorder, and clinically we just miss these kids with language impairments, and we miss language impairments within other neurodevelopmental disorders, and why, how can they do so well that they sort of sneak past us in something that's so fundamental to how we engage with the world. And yeah, that's why I think this idea of lateralization and sort of the brain finding a way to figure out language and function and meeting environmental demands, that it just really brings together a lot of questions I have related to sort of atypical language development and why we're having such a hard time understanding what's going on there. I don't know if that answered your question at all. I just got excited. If you could repeat this maybe second half there, I'm happy to give more of an answer.
Yeah, no, it's just a very broad question. I'm fascinated about these dynamical changes in our brain, and we often only look at things from maybe an adult perspective, and to see how this changes throughout development. And so I just was curious from your expertise of kind of what that has you thinking about and what ideas it has inspired for you in terms of what you do. And I think you've indicated some of those there.
Good. Whew. Answer something. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I love just an shared enthusiasm question. I also, you just jogged in my mind. I remember from long ago learning about the Waddington epigenetic landscape, where sort of, if this way doesn't work, you find another way. And if this way doesn't work, and sort of you can end up in the same place by very different routes. And I just think that maps onto the functional, the fMRI data in such an interesting way and a really parallel way. So it just is sort of making sense of how we're all developing slightly differently, and how you can end up in a similar place, even with these slightly different trajectories. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you everyone for coming. We will not see you next week due to the holiday, so enjoy the break. I hope everyone is able to take a nice break from work, and we will reconvene in 2 weeks.
Thank you all.